So today we're going to go through, we have 1 hour, so I'll be going rather quickly. Go through some slides to summarize a research project that's being supported by the Environmental Trust Fund of New Brunswick, looking at economic impact and community energy plans. I'll talk a little bit more about the project as we go, and a little bit about Quest. I think all of you know Quest to some level, so I won't spend too much time on that, but I do want to make the connection to Quest principles to this work. We're going to focus in on what we're describing as the transitioning energy economy and use that as a foundation to talk about how community energy plans can have local positive economic impact. So we'll talk about a description and definition of that economy, the scale of that economy, how jobs are actually created, and we'll talk about that in a qualitative and quantitative way, and report on some of the research that we've done so far. And linking that to that last bullet is how do municipalities enable this transitioning economy, energy economy, for local benefit. And we'll look at a more technical way of how one estimates job creation. Because it's a research project and we're very interested in the feedback of practitioners and other interested stakeholders like yourselves, we're going to do a very simple survey today. We'll have a little bit of fun with that. If any of you are familiar with Mentimeter, you'll know what I'm talking about. I have just a handful of questions. So if you have your device handy, or even a second screen on your desktop, log into menti.com and enter that code, and you'll see the survey come up, and I'll be driving that survey from here. Okay. So we'll get right into that survey with our first question. And what we're wondering, and what we're asking many stakeholders, is how the community energy plan is seen as an economic development driver. This is an opinion survey, so don't worry too much about the fine detail. We're interested in your opinion from your standpoint, depending on what you do. I see it's working. We have some votes here. And this is what it is now, not what you believe it should be, but what you see now, whether you're logging in today from a specific municipality or you have some understanding of the marketplace generally. We'd be interested in what you see. So what we really mean is a perceived local value from high to low across the horizontal axis there. And if you see it as a differentiator for your community or a potential differentiator from other economic potential in your community. So I see one vote coming in. Some of you might still be logging on. I'll tell you what, we can come back to that if you're still looking to log in, and I'll go back to the presentation. So just a bit of introduction and Quest overview. As I said, I just want to connect the purpose of Quest and what its principal basis is and how it connects to this work. As many of you know, it's a national organization looking to drive the development of smart energy communities and the way we define it as resilient, affordable, healthy, and prosperous. Building awareness around the benefits of smart energy communities is what this project is all about, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Really the link between efficient, integrated, and localized energy systems and the local economy is what we're talking about here today. So when we talk about smart energy communities, we define them this way, and I want to use this as a touchstone for some of the future slides I have. Energy efficiency is at the heart of it. As we all know, efficiency is the fundamental of any smart energy community. We sometimes describe that as shrinking the pie before you begin to look at different ways to deliver energy, create and deliver energy. So integrating conventional energy networks and harnessing local energy generation opportunities. And this is where the last one is where municipalities play such a huge role as if in land use planning that links to not only efficiency, but the potential to integrate decentralized infrastructure. So I want to look at these principles. I'm not going to go through them all, obviously. I just want to highlight two of them that really create the basis for this project. I've talked about improving efficiency as the #1 principle, all the way to the number 12 principle of pursuing policy and program stability. So this really is where municipalities have the opportunity to send signals to the marketplace that they are moving towards a smart energy configuration in their community that ultimately attracts investment from an active and growing market for products and services. And I'll talk a bit about that coming up. So about this specific project, we're looking to articulate the local economic benefits. We often talk about local economic benefits in a very anecdotal way. There's not too many folks who would argue against the economic benefits, but they're often not articulated or quantified. And this is what we're attempting to do with this project. The purpose for it, of course, is to improve the value proposition, to use a marketing term that you might be familiar with, so that you increase buy-in from the communities and stakeholders in the community, based on the fact that municipalities alone don't transition their communities to smart energy communities. It's about engaging the marketplace and other actors in the broader space. So we have 3 major goals in this project: is development of a communication package, and a lot of the material that I'm presenting today really feeds into hopefully more succinct communication to your communities and other stakeholders. It's our intention to disseminate this work further to local governments. We're currently focused on New Brunswick, obviously, but with Quest being a national organization, we have channels to the entire country in the local government space. And lastly, and this is ongoing, is to clarify the economic development role of municipalities and articulate it further. So this project has 3 process milestones: research, which is complete now. A lot of the stuff I'll share with you today comes from that research. So what information is out there in academia, industry, advocacy groups, et cetera, around economic impact of smart energy communities and all the components of that. We're in the very tail end of 2. This webinar is really in category number 2, where we're actually presenting that to stakeholders like yourselves, interested parties, practitioners, for your feedback. So this is where I do encourage you to provide, sorry about that background noise, folks. And lastly is provincial dissemination, where we'll be creating a workbook, a primer, and really a guide to help you further understand and even calculate job creation impacts from this work. And now I'd like to move to a more definition, and this is where we get into communication material. What is a transitioning energy economy? We talk about it. I think everybody has a basic understanding of it. We wanted to dive in and get something that's closer to a definition and a common understanding so that the discussions about it find a sort of central core. I personally use these slides actually in a lot of my work when I'm talking to municipalities. And then, the opening segment is, this is not necessarily new. A lot of our research has been economic, where we look at how any market transitions over time. And not just the energy market, but we obviously aware of other markets around the internet, food economies, etc. Energy is no different in terms of the fundamentals. So, this going back 100, 150 years, we know energy was supplied locally. This is pretty intuitive when you see the photos and you have an understanding, historical understanding. Harnessing water, using animal power, burning wood, etc. And the centralizing of infrastructure is really the transition that happened from that initial period that I've just showed you. And there's plenty of evidence. It's quite fascinating, actually, to dive into the history of how energy systems have evolved. Here's just some graphical pictures of that related to New Brunswick. Even in the early days of its electricity system, they were looking to do conservation and demand management. You can see on the far right some of the large electrical distribution systems are shown on the left. The picture at the bottom, a quick anecdote there, that's from my hometown of Guelph. That's a coal gas plant that's obviously long defunct, but was actually created as a local utility, and it provided gas to light gas street lamps in downtown, which is not too far from there. And it's pretty easy to start to see the link between energy and economic development, where Guelph was one of the first towns to actually have streetlights in its downtown core for extended shopping hours. Then it starts to look at how it affects economy and culture. There's obviously a broad category, but some evidence here around home services, around cooking. Some of these are rather amusing in terms of how old they are, how they're projected. Electricity was Canada's answer. That's something from the CNE in Toronto. This picture on the bottom is New Brunswick. It's the first power plant in New Brunswick, and that's a woolen mill right beside it. Of course, we jump ahead quite significantly to the highly centralized infrastructure that we have today that supplies our energy and fuel. And we're aware of this. This is in the news right now, obviously, with Western pipelines, et cetera. Can be quite controversial, very, very expensive, and quite inefficient. And that's where I want to segue to this slide. This is a Sankey diagram for those who may be familiar with it. This comes from the town of Oakville that they've given us permission to use. It really shows how energy flows to certain end uses and the inefficiencies inherent in it. It does look complex at first glance, but all of the black or gray lines are really wasted energy. And so a quick view of this, you can see significant amounts of energy are wasted from highly centralized systems. And so that's where we disconnect from some of the principles that Quest espouses around matching energy supply, distribution to end use. So I have some other slides that dive into this, about making cups of coffee powered by large centralized generation systems as an example of that. And so this is the status quo, and something that has become a reality for all municipalities and large distribution systems. And so there's great potential in there. So if you segue from that waste and start looking at the economic implications of it, and this is where we're trying to bring it back to local. This is a picture from a utility, Guelph Hydro, who, to their great credit, actually put this in one of their annual reports that shows how many dollars from a typical electricity bill leave the community to supply that infrastructure that I showed you in a few slides back. Only 22% of the typical electricity bill in Guelph stays in the city. And so that's a quite a literal quantified testament to how dollars leave the community under the current situation of centralized energy systems. And obviously those dollars are not in the local economy after they leave. So now we come back to a pictorial example of what a smart energy community looks like, and all these elements. I'm not going to walk through them all, you're familiar with them, but they're all distributed energy resources and localized energy resources distribution systems driven by efficiency. And really, if you take all the elements of this photo or this graphic, you will be able to dive into what are the markets of products and services that are existing and growing that supply to that picture, essentially. And that's what I want to talk a little bit about. So, just a very simple picture here is that we go from local to central to local again, which really defines how a lot of markets transition, particularly the energy market. And at local again really means this, this is the jump off point for the real opportunity for local positive economic impact. And I want to dive into that. So doing all the research that we've done, the reading, the general description of a transitioning energy economy, the specific description of a transitioning energy economy, we've come up with a definition. And I've shown that to you somewhat in pictures already, from centralized forms to local disaggregated forms. And it really is, the attributes of it are an increase, quite a rapid increase of readily available technologies and services that can serve community energy plans. The vast majority of those are located or implemented locally. And so a community energy plan, which is a generic term for the kinds of plans that have been done significantly in New Brunswick. There's well over 50 CEPs done in New Brunswick, are really create channels for those local markets. So all those purveyors of products and services are looking for channels to markets, given that we've described them as local. And so the role of municipalities can be significant in attracting investments from that market. And then we want to sort of segue from that into a little bit more detail about those last two bullets. So I'd like to just go back to the survey. I only see one vote, so I'm not sure if people are having trouble logging into Menti. I don't see any Q&A on that. If you do are having problems, let us know. We're asking you if you see evidence, given what I've just described. I know it's been very quick, but do you see evidence of a transitioning energy economy in your community? Again, this is just a opinion survey. People are seeing this. I'm just looking to see if there's an understanding of what the evidence of a transitioning energy economy looks like. And thanks to those who've given answers. Okay, so let me talk a little bit about market activity. What's going on out there in this transitioning energy economy? There's a lot of information there, a lot. Let's talk a little bit about scale in a kind of qualitative way. It's grown significantly in the last 20 years, so it's a young market, relatively speaking. The channels to these new markets are driven to a large degree by local governments. And, you know, I'll just say anecdotally, any discussion I have with an actor in the marketplace, they're really struggling and looking for ways to get access to activity on the ground in communities overseen by local governments, especially those who've done community energy plans. So the channels to the markets are very disaggregated for these companies and quite challenging, but they do understand that there's definitely a movement. We know from Quest's research that approximately 350 communities in Canada have done community energy plans, and I can assure you that that actors in the market are very aware of that and looking for ways to aggregate access to those communities. So local governments who do have, unlike energy, which is a new purview for local governments, typically has not been a concern of local governments. What they have had a purview over is local economies. Almost every municipality has an economic development department or a community organization who are largely motivated by the positive economic impacts of various parts of the economy. And we are looking through this work and other messaging to include the energy market into that. Community energy plans are widely seen to have a large number of benefits beyond economic impact. And I've just put that there to point that out. It's both a challenge and an opportunity. There's so many benefits, and we're all familiar with those, promoting those benefits, but many of them are not articulated nor quantifiable and become very difficult to support a really concise and focused value proposition sometimes. Quest has done some high-level research in terms of potential across the country. These are very impressive numbers, significant numbers that the Smart Energy Communities marketplace, and it's shown pictorially in the infographic on the left side, 700,000 persons growing in a growing $700 billion industry. So all market sizes here are generally referenced in billions, and I'll show you some more in a second. How many companies organizations and service providers that are serving that marketplace. It's in the neighborhood of 51,000, generating $82 billion in revenues annually. So we start to see the significance and scale of the opportunity. This is something that I do, and this changes all the time, but just set your Google alerts to various market watching organizations, researchers, and market reports. You get a sense of the size of markets, and I've just done some samples here. Distributed energy generation market, over $500 million by 2025. And these are, these targets are imminent, if not past. Even if you look at energy efficiency investments back in 2015, it's $220 billion globally. US market for green buildings, $69 billion. Energy efficiency device market, almost $1 trillion by 2022. And the one that I think has the greatest growth potential is around district heating, which is a market that's not highly penetrated in the US or North America compared to Europe. $280 billion only a few years from now. And I show these, and there's many, many more as I could. When you work in economic development for any municipality, this is where you start. When you already have a strategy that identifies market segments, advanced manufacturing, agriculture, etc., you gather up this market information because you want to attract investment from these markets that are quantified here into your communities. It's general, simple description of what economic development's all about. So I just wanted to get a sense of, thanks for those who answered, thank you. The perception of scale is one that I wanted to get at here. I've shown you some very impressive numbers. Do you see this as competitive with other sectors? And I haven't done a comparative analysis here. I'm just asking about perception at this moment. And what we're pushing back in is, I think, that economic development professionals may not be aware of the size of these markets and may consider them small or, special interest type activities. One of our goals is to uncover that information that describes it in a much more quantified way, so we get a comparative analysis of how it compares to other sectors. And thank you those who've answered. Thank you. So we want to talk a little about a little bit about how jobs are created. So this is where we kind of move to a quasi-technical review. I think I'll take a moment here to just talk a little bit about our research. There's a great deal of research about how jobs are created. And we read about job creation all the time in the media, in different sectors. But generally speaking, that kind of information, especially with the technical analysis of how you determine those job creations, is generally sort of national level, sometimes regional level. So there's a bit of a gap in terms of what's available for local economies. And that's a challenge I think many folks know already, is that local economies can be very challenging to define and quantify highly. But we have found some information I think we'll find useful. And obviously, this project is a jump-off point for Quest to continue to do research and information sharing around the general topic of local economies and smart energy communities. So I referenced this earlier. This is actually a Quest table. The number of benefits are huge. And I've described this sort of two ways. One of them is that there's so many that it's sometimes very hard to have a concise message around the value proposition to local communities for doing community energy planning and implementation. This comes somewhat from my own experience, but I am aware that others experience as well, is one of the biggest challenges is around economic benefits. To actually define it, how it works, how it's calculated, how you communicate it is an important. So we wanted to focus in on that. We're not ignoring other benefits. And even if you go into the other columns, you can see that environmental, human, and social benefits can also have economic impact as well. We're not necessarily trying to include all of them and make them all economic oriented. We're really focusing on this first column for this presentation and this project at the moment. So we're going to talk about 3 ways jobs are created by implementing CEPs. The main one is keeping local dollars in the community. And I've already given you a little background about how centralized infrastructure does take a fair amount of money out of communities. Anybody who's been party to an estimate of how many dollars are spent on energy in a community for heating, cooling, transportation, and lighting generally, is always impressed by the size of that number. And I'm going to show you some examples coming up. But that's an important starting point to understand the potential to keep those dollars in your community. It's also worth pointing out that those dollars are highly inflation risk, have a high inflation risk, sorry, and that most folks will agree that energy costs are going to go nowhere but up. So then we'll go into the second bullet in that red box. So what's the direct, indirect, and induced job creation that comes from these local dollars? Now we're getting at a point where there's a bit more ease in coming up with estimate job creation. And the last one I'll touch on a little bit around how new dollars can be attracted for investment activities that support CEPs. All the activities that drive that efficiency, that keeps dollars local, can attract quite a lot of investment. So predicting local economic activity is difficult. I've mentioned that before. There's many ways to go, as I'm not going to turn this into a seminar about how one does economic modeling. But this is quite sobering in the sense of the work it would take to create local economic models can be significant. Most of our research shows that estimating economic impact from energy activity, smart energy activity, is found in the multipliers category. In other words, how many jobs per $1 million of investment or dollars into a community can be calculated. And that's the road we're going to go down here today. So a little bit about how multipliers are affected in 3 categories. It's fairly intuitive. Direct jobs come from the activities defined in a community energy plan and those being implemented. I've shown some pictures here of local generation through solar, retrofitting existing homes and new homes, etc. And then the engineering, design, and activities that come with it. Those are direct activities. Indirect jobs come from the supply chains that supply all those, so nuts and bolts, obviously, for any given technology. Even local hardware stores can be quite an important indirect supplier of products, especially for home renovation and home retrofitting, and the transportation systems that bring those to your community. Induced jobs are really the ones that can have a significant impact in terms of how those freed up dollars in your community, the salaries for activities, the labor that supports these activities, and direct and indirect jobs can be spent in your community. So we've shown some sort of iconic examples of that: shopping, restaurants, entertainment. Those are 3 categories that are calculable, and generally how multipliers are applied. Okay, we've got another survey question. We only have a handful here. Just trying to get a sense of how your community, and maybe I could define that as those that are paying attention to your community energy planning, stakeholders, and other interested parties, see as the foremost benefit of community energy plans. I find this one of the most interesting questions. I think they're often talked about through the environmental lens. And I would argue that that has, although they overlap, potentially a different audience for those that might see the economic benefit. Yeah. So this simple survey would confirm what I see in other conversations. And thank you for those that responded. Okay, back to a little bit. Oops, sorry, I keep going ahead. Back to a little bit about how the role of municipalities. So this is an important thing to point out. That's a pretty fundamental thing about community energy plans. Local governments take the lead on creating those plans almost exclusively, or the vast majority, but it does take an entire community. So the outreach to communities, the engagement with stakeholders, and I would enhance that point, the engagement with the marketplace is an important aspect of implementing community energy plans and enabling the transition. So I'm coming back to some of the policy principles here. Obviously, these could be seminars, each of these on their own, but municipalities' activities can help create channels, market channels for those that provide products and services. I wanted to just focus on the last two, emphasize performance and outcomes and policies and regulations. So this is really all about job creation and the outcomes that come from the policies that come out of a community energy plan, et cetera, and the stability of those policy and programs. And I'll give you some examples. So these are excerpts from a number of community energy plans done in New Brunswick. I've just pulled them out. So what I've really done is look at the action plans, the principles and high-level goals, and pulled out those that make somewhat or specific reference to economy. And we're quite pleased to see that in New Brunswick, most of the plans do have language similar to this, if not exactly across. So we see already that we've created some hooks in the plan to make links to economic development. What we're attempting to do here is to strengthen those links and talk about how they are done. I've just put some X's for targets here. Municipalities pick different targets for reducing the greenhouse gas emissions and the energy changes that have to happen to allow for those changes. So I'm not being specific here, I'm just showing some typical. So I can be specific here. Sussex, New Brunswick, and St. John, New Brunswick participated with us in a little bit up close and personal review of this work. And we had a closer look at their economic development plans and their community energy plans, or in this case, community GHG energy action plans, just another name for community energy plan. And it is important to see here, Sussex particularly is a small community, but is highly aware of the energy assets that they have in their community, and have identified those in their economic development strategy. I've just pulled the priorities. There's 8 priorities, I believe. 2 of them specifically refer to energy. So those who know Sussex know that they have a closed potash mine that has great potential for geothermal energy development and distribution. And they also have a natural gas field in their region that has lots of regulatory aspects to it, but they see it as a potential for their community and that can serve the goals of their community energy plan. So you can see the language that's in their plan that makes a link to that, creating new market opportunities, innovative energy solutions, attractive to local businesses, that foster retention and growth. Business retention and expansion is an acronym, BRE, that you'll see in most communities. And they see this as a community that's gone through a lot of economic stress, mostly because of the closing of the mine. And they see BRE as something that's very important to them, and they've made that link. So I've shown this here as an example of a literal link between energy planning, GHG planning, and economic planning as an illustration. Can it be more specific? Yes. Will it be? I think it will. And they continue to to evolve both of these plans. I have another example from St. John, slightly differently portrayed in terms of the language and the structure of their economic development plan. This is a regional plan for St. John. They've got 4 focus areas: workforce, entrepreneur development, innovation, investment, and marketing St. John. So that's the advantage that we talked about, differentiator we talked about in the survey earlier. So integrated into those focus areas is more specifics around securing significant investment in energy, leveraging assets that they do have already, and St. John has a number of them. Foremost among them is their existing district energy system, which they have the potential to expand. And they see that as a foundational strength. So like any good economic development plan, they want to leverage their existing value and strengths. And very same language actually as the Sussex plan around creating market opportunities. So they've taken this rather somewhat general statements, high level statements, and link them to their economic development plan. So in Sussex and St. John, it's worth pointing out that they've done this already. These plans have all been created in fairly recent times, and it's their first cut. But I believe it's a doorway for further alignment, further perception of value. Their economic development plans in both examples are created very similarly to their greenhouse gas action plans and energy action plans, in that there's strong community input. So the opportunity to see the value of their energy and GHG plans in an economic lens has already begun and has great potential to grow. So I think we're down to, thank you. One last question. And so this is an observation about how integrated are your CEPs and ECDEV strategies in your community, or if you're not coming to us today from a specific community, what's your perception of that integration? I'm going to say anecdotally here that New Brunswick has done a pretty good job of doing that integration. I've seen examples elsewhere. Other parts of the country, less so. So I think there's a great deal of opportunity going forward for that integration. Thank you for your response. I just do a time check here. I don't see any Q&A, so I'm just going to keep going. We've got about 15 minutes left in our 1 hour time slot here. I just want to do a quick overview of how we estimate jobs created. So this moves to a somewhat more technical view. I'll just say, I will be going quickly, that this is not the only chance, obviously, for anybody to see this. This will be included in our workbook and primer that we'll be distributing and made available in New Brunswick, and I expect through Quest channels as well. And this webinar itself will be recorded and able for viewing subsequent to today. So this is sample community in New Brunswick. I've taken the name off, but just to give you an idea how energy is used in gigajoules, the weighting across the board, you can see very quickly here that electricity and gasoline for transportation are the 2 big energy users measured in gigajoules. But this is a profile that every community does when they do a community energy plan, or certainly should do, especially if they want to do further analysis on economic impact. And I'll explain how we move to that in a second. There we go. So we take those same numbers that you've seen on this table. It looks rather complicated, and we've estimated cost per gigajoule. Those are fairly broad estimates. They change regionally, even within the region of this particular municipality, but they're certainly within a margin of error. And they're also at today's cost. It's always worth pointing out that these costs are climbing all the time. What we're aiming to do here is get that number I referred to earlier. the total energy costs, how much is being spent in your community on energy? And we include transportation in that as well. $300 million in this particular example at today's costs. So if we go back to the slide I showed you earlier about dollars leaving a community to support highly centralized infrastructure, each fuel type here has its different infrastructure and variations on the percentage, but all the studies we've seen or any kind of analysis we've seen shows that at least 80% of that number across the board at a blended kind of ratio leaves the community. And the goal of Community Energy Plan is really to keep as many dollars as we can local and estimate the impact of doing so. So I want to walk through that a little bit here. So this sample city has, and I've made this up to be honest with you, has created a 50% target in terms of improving the efficiency of energy use, the related cost at today's dollars. Some municipalities have much more aggressive numbers, some have even smaller numbers. But what we're doing is we're really taking that emissions target reduction through energy end use reduction and putting dollar values to it so that we can leverage it into an analysis of job creation. So in this example, if a 15% reduction at today's cost is achieved, $45 million stay in the community. So the question is, how does that convert to local jobs? This is a result of a great deal of research in a fairly simple graph. I'm going to just walk you through it very quickly. The red columns are really the ones that we're going to look at. The first one is the average, so that's not specific to any targeted expenditure. This is job creation in the community. All of these multipliers are in jobs per $1 million. And that's the average, and you'll see how that plays out later. Utilities and the expenditures that get made on utilities and that they go on to spend to build and manage their infrastructure is about 9 jobs per million. Construction, we move along to construction, and construction is a broad category: home renovation, installation of district energy piping, to be specific about energy activity in that category, installation of solar panels, etc. Highly labor intensive. And this is where we start looking at local potential for job creation. So we see construction actually is near the very top. There's some other interesting side facts here that government is a great job creator. Service industry, predictably, is very high as well. So it's those 3 red bars that I want to focus in on and see if we can use them to do some analysis. So when we look at job creation, there's really 2 elements to it. There's the investment phase, which is, and I'll use just a visual example here for you. Imagine a home retrofits or building retrofits. There's the activity itself that results in the design, engineering, installation of hardware, in the case of a home retrofit or solar panel installation, etc. That creates jobs. Those are construction jobs. The saving phase is really the fact that energy costs have been reduced as a result of that investment phase, and there's ongoing local benefit because of that. So there's 2 lines below. This is really a tabular or a table version of the chart I just showed you. So we're comparing to the average job creation in an economy. Those dollars have gone now to construction to a certain amount, and there's a net benefit of 3 jobs. So in other words, construction investments create more jobs than the average in a community. The savings phase is kind of straightforward, is that dollars that used to go to the utility and create 9 jobs per $1 million now goes to the economy, the average economy, to create 17 jobs. So one of the things that I observed in my research is that many references to job creation are often not comparative. They'll often see that 20 jobs per $1 million is created as a result of home retrofits or building retrofits, and that's not wrong. But they're not necessarily new jobs. They're dollars that would otherwise go to the economy and be less efficient in terms of economic performance. So it's important to point that out. one of the things about economics is that dollars really go from one place to another, and which one has, you know, more impact on local economy is really what we're after here. So if we take these generic numbers, and by the way, these are provided by the American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy, probably the brain trust on this topic, and I actually have a reference here at the bottom, which you'll see later. And I encourage anybody to have a look at that material. They have quite an archive of material on the topic of job creation. So now we take this example, and this is a lot. So if we have to revisit this, or you have to revisit this later, please do. But I just want to walk through a calculation. So the example town of $300 million a year looking for a 15% savings is going to keep $45 million in a community. If we estimate that $360 million needs to be invested to achieve that savings over 8 years, so we've taken some estimates about an investor expectation. They would be looking for a $360 million investment. So that's where we can determine, and I apologize, there's a bit of a typo there, but $360 million is the correct number. Investment phase, the $360 million requirement creates 3 jobs, and that's from the table previously. And so we do simple arithmetic, and we see that over 1,000 jobs can be potentially created to do the activities identified in the plan. And then the savings phase is really the avoided energy costs that are achieved through the investment, creates 8 jobs, a net of 8 jobs per $1 million. And that's 360 jobs that's ongoing, 360 jobs for 20 years, which is an estimate of how long the effect of a retrofit can take place. It is worth pointing out those are in today's dollars, so they can only increase as the inflationary cost of energy goes up. We haven't done that estimate. And this is my last slide. There's other activities that can create jobs as well. Large-scale projects like the installation of large solar farms or combined heat and power, microgrids, or district energy, which I've shown in pictures there. The local impact can depend on, you know, the location of manufacturing, installation, etc. And I'll throw in some anecdotes here. In Guelph, where we did some district energy installation, literally that guy you see in the picture there is a local labor supply. So the company that did the work did hire locally, which was part of the deal, but that's not always guaranteed. And the other is another anecdote I'll share with you. This goes back to the principle about you know, strong alignment of policy and signals to the market around that policy are very important. In Guelph, we had an example of Canadian Solar, which at the time was the top manufacturer in the world. They're actually a Chinese company. I don't know if they're the top at the moment, but they certainly are at the top 5. We're looking for a location for the North American plant. And they found Guelph initially through Google. It's not complicated, but we were at the time I was working out of economic development. So another part of the story is that the community energy plan manager was working in economic development, literally. That's where I sat. And so Canadian Solar found Guelph, liked our messaging around community energy planning and economic development, and that brought them to the table. And they ended up locating their factory here. It still remains here to this day. At its peak, it had 600 jobs. The market in Ontario has changed significantly, and there's fewer jobs there, but they still maintain the factory and about 100 jobs. So you can see, and I throw this in here, you can see that projection of policy alignment between economic development and community energy planning can have huge signals to the marketplace. It's no coincidence that the majority of solar panels in Guelph and we have about 3% of our total energy load is supplied by solar. Majority of those panels are Canadian solar panels. So I have just a few more questions. And thank you for answering. So this is a question about, I know I've gone through rather quickly today, but the question that we're interested in, and Quest certainly interested, is do CEP practitioners and local government interests feel they have enough information to support good messaging around job creation benefit? Obviously something the Quest is very interested in supporting. And sorry if I pushed you off that last question. I'm not sure how you see it at your end. And this is a similar question. Do you see that CEPs and job creation is too complex to communicate to your community? We're trying to get a sense of how much this needs to be focused in terms of communication clarity. Yeah. Yes. Okay, thank you for that. Okay, well, I see it's 5:02, and that completes the formal part of our presentation. I don't see any questions. Charlotte, I don't know if you can just open everybody's mic, and if they have any questions, they can just put them out verbally, or you could use the chat group.
Yeah, I unmute all the participants, so
Yeah.
Feel free to ask your question. If we have any.
Okay. Well, hearing none, I thank you for attending today. Just a final statement about it. The project is that we have your contact info. We'll keep you up to date on activities. You might have other ways to keep track of that as well. Quest will be making this presentation available as a recording. You can share that with your colleagues, rewatch it again yourself. Also, when the project is complete and we disseminate our workbook, which will essentially be framed around the presentation you saw today with more detail underneath it, you'll certainly be made aware of its availability. And lastly, here's my email address and phone number. I am happy to chat with anybody if you have any questions or you need any support for your ongoing work. I'm happy to chat with you about that, so feel free to call me or write me at this contact info. Okay. So with that, I'll thank you again. Wish you a great weekend, and stay safe, everybody.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you.